So I'm Cynthia Henshaw, and I am the executive director at the East Quabbin Land Trust. So we cover an 8-town region just east of the Quabbin Reservoir. We got started back almost 30 years now. Our 30th anniversary is next year, and I have been at the East Quabbin Land Trust for 17 years. Before that, I've also worked at New England Forestry Foundation and also at Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, doing a whole different variety of different kind of projects. But one of the things I love about working at a small organization is that you get to actually do a lot of different things. So it's very, very challenging, and there's always more stuff to learn. So that's a little bit about me. Olivia?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olivia Lukacic, and I'm a land conservation specialist at the Trustees. So if you're not familiar with the Trustees, we work statewide across Massachusetts. I'm seeing that my connection is maybe unstable, so I'm going to go off video. Apologies. We work statewide across the state of Massachusetts, doing any number of conservation projects and restoration projects and conservation restrictions. I've been at the Trustees for a little over a year and a half, and before that I was working for UMass Extension and have done contract work for the Lincoln Land Institute and Mass Woodlands Institute. And although I am fairly new to doing deals myself, I think it could be helpful to have some perspective of someone that hasn't been doing it for decades. So I'm really happy to kind of share my story as I've really started to get more and more deals under my belt as we go. And so Cynthia and I are going to really be focusing on due diligence, following specifically LTA standards and practices. So Barbara, if you're good, I think we can go ahead and share screen and get going. Does that sound good?
Sounds good. Just making sure everybody knows you're in the what you're about to learn a little bit more about, and then we'll have discussion and questions at the end of this session. We're here to talk about due diligence. And one of the things to keep in mind, at least from my perspective, is that whenever you're doing land conservation projects, there's always more to learn. So even though I've been doing land conservation projects for a while and have done a whole variety of them, there's always something new, some new twist or challenge. And so, part of, I think, what Olivia and I are going to be sharing is that there are times and reasons when you want to also, do your own deep dive into some of these pieces, but also use professionals appropriately. And we have, a suite of professionals across Massachusetts. And reach out to colleagues, see which ones they've worked with, what has worked out well. But those are kind of important things. That's why we're a good network, and to be sure to network with your other land trust partners across the state to help do that. So what is due diligence? Basically, due diligence is trying to kind of minimize the risk, and it's a compliance check that happens. And in this case, we're talking about with land conservation projects. You're gonna, you think about your organization, you do due diligence when you have an event, right? You have a sign-in sheet, you make sure that, information is shared appropriately. There's all different kinds of due diligence for different practices and issues that land trusts come up with. Today, we're going to focus on those core pieces of due diligence for doing a land conservation project. So these are all about kind of investigating and reviewing the facts about the land and the ownership to be sure that you as the person for the land trust are really making sure that you're getting what you think you're getting when you're either buying land or buying a conservation restriction or accepting either of those two entities. So next slide. These are, and we're, Olivia and I are focusing on standard 9 from the standards, LTA standards and practices. So this is what all of our land trusts and in any entity, if you're a town, should be thinking about how you're approaching land acquisition. And we're going to be focusing on the ones that are bolded here. So kind of the environmental due diligence, the survey work, the property boundary stuff, the title investigation, actually being sure that you know where the property is and that there is clear title, that the people that you're acquiring it from really do have the do own it and can transfer it to you, to your land trust. And then some of the specific pieces about purchasing the actual acquisition. These are the key aspects. And the top in 9 was also this A and B, and we aren't going to go into this too much, but just to be clear, these, you know, for every transaction, again, you know, your lawyer, whoever is your lawyer, is going to be a key partner in making sure that your transaction, your purchase, your acceptance of a donation is done appropriately, and it meets all of the requirements, the financial and the tax requirements for the land trust, and that you're also that number B is to be sure that you know that you're telling the landowners that are making donations to you that you're not providing the legal, financial, or tax advice to them, that they need to have their own attorney. And in some cases, they also want to use the same attorney, and that can happen. It just needs to be explicitly stated and up front, and sometimes there's a letter that both parties can sign, and so that's just being clear about who is providing what legal, financial, or tax advice to the landowner. Okay, so then next slide, Olivia.
Great. So Cynthia and I thought the most useful way to actually go about talking about due diligence, because it can look really different for every project that you're working on and every transaction, is that we're going to go through 3 different case studies that we think show examples of just different aspects of due diligence, some things that come up, different approaches you can take, and then hopefully leave enough time for questions at the end as well, for instances that might not be covered in these examples, or just clarifying questions about these examples. So we're going to look at a case study about a fee gift, and then a more complicated transaction with some pre-acquisition, and then an APR sale, and then a fee purchase at the end. So the first one we're going to talk about is that fee gift, acceptance of a gift. And this is a project that the trustees worked on. It is an addition of 34 acres to our Pegan Hill Reservation in Dover and Natick. So you can see outlined in red are these 4 parcels that were owned by Mr. Morse. And for the trustees, we do a lot of work that expands our existing reservations. So we're often purchasing additional buffering lands or accepting donations of additional buffers. And in this instance, Mr. Morse had already donated a CR on these parcels in 2007. He was originally going to wait until his death to bequest this land to us, and then got really excited at an engagement event and just like called us and was like, I want to make this happen now. So we worked with him to accept this donation of these 34 acres into our larger Pegan Hill Reservation. In terms of the first piece of due diligence that I'm going to talk about is this environmental assessment. And so really what we're doing when we're doing environmental assessment work on a property is we don't want to be taking on any burden of contaminated land or land that just has potential issues that are going to need really extensive or expensive cleanup that might be subject to any types of regulations. And especially for the trustees, we work a lot with having our properties be open to the public and public engagement. So we want those properties to be safe and available to our visitors. And so for this project in particular, we contracted out Ransom Consulting to do an phase 1 environmental site assessment. And we also wanted to give some costs associated with some of these different parts of due diligence. So when we reached out to Ransom, we said, you know, this is the site, gave them some basic details and asked for a phase 1 environmental site assessment. And they responded with a scope of work, which you see on the screen, to just really outline what they were going to be doing as part of this project, as well as a estimated cost for what that phase one would be. So for this phase one, our cost ended up being $3,250. So quite a large budget item for this otherwise acceptance of a donation of a project. So when they actually conducted the work, it looks like a bunch of different pieces. It involves a site visit. So I went out with one of their consultants, and we walked the site and took pictures of a number of different sites. They do a bunch of research at the town hall, in the registry of deeds, talking to neighbors, talking to the previous landowners to really get a sense of the project. And then what happens is they compile this environmental site assessment report, and it's quite lengthy. I think this report was over 200 pages. It includes background research, these site visit notes. It includes the EDR package that they contracted out to get, which is just in more environmental data. And then they provide some analysis as well on top of that. So you can see their recommendation on the screen is that the assessment revealed no evidence of RECs, which are recognized environmental conditions. The one piece that was a little bit of a hang up was this storage container. You can see in photo 5, AST, that you'll see at the bottom of that screen grab is above ground storage tank. And so when you're walking the site, those are really good things to look at. Where does the soil look a little bit different? Where is there leftover garbage or refuse? And is it have the potential that is contaminating either at the surface level or below the surface? And so when I was out with this consultant, we dug around a little bit under that above ground storage container. And I think he did maybe even grab like a small soil sample to bring back, but ultimately their recommendation and conclusion was that there was not any major defect with this property. And so we were able to take this report, keep it in our files so that if something were to come up later, we could review back and say, we did have this report documenting our site analysis. If something had come up, let's say this above ground storage tank had actually been filled with fluid and had been leaking some sort of gasoline or fluid contaminant into the soil, their recommendation might have been for a phase 2 environmental site assessment, which is just a more extensive gathering of data and evidence and soil testing and other environmental testing, and ultimately giving a recommendation of how to clean up that site. And if there is an issue that comes up on site, it is really important that we would have gotten that cleared up before the transaction actually happened. We wouldn't want to be saying, great, we know that there's a contamination, like all good, let's take on this property. We'd want to be talking with that landowner and coming up with a plan of who's going to pay for that remediation. What is the timeline for that? Is that something that it's a big enough risk or small enough risk that we are still willing to accept this transaction, even with these potential contaminants on it? So that's the environmental site assessment for this property. Moving on to the title investigation. So when we talk about title, as Cynthia said at the beginning, title is really just the right to the land. And so we at land trusts and towns and other land holding organizations need to determine that the landowner has the right to sell the property or the rights of that property to our land holding organization. And this is something where we contract out with a title company to get a title report done. And this is a much more extensive review of the registry of deeds, of other documents that are showing what has that transfer of ownership been over time, what is the actual description of the property, and what issues are coming up in that title search that has been done. And really the goal here is to identify any issues and then make a plan to make sure that when we've done any type of additional work that needs to happen, any clarification documents, any affidavits, that we're trying to get as close to free from major defects as possible when that title is transferred from the landowner to the organization. For this Morse property, there weren't any major issues. As I mentioned, we were already the CR landowner on site, so we really already had done some level of due diligence when that transaction had happened. But you'll see in red outline there, said estate is subject to, there's that conservation restriction. So theoretically, when you've gotten this far in a project, you know if there's already a CR on the property, but this can be really interesting in what comes up with less formalized easements or access rights that neighbors might have, hunting groups, other organizations that might have some claim to that property. And another really common one that will come up on these title reports is a mortgage that will come up that the landowner had out on that property. And it's important to understand where exactly this title comes in terms of, is this a CR project like Cynthia will talk about in terms of an agricultural preservation restriction, and we're only taking hold of some of those rights, or for a mortgage, does that need to be discharged for a full fee acquisition of a project? And so when we get this initial title report back, we review it with our attorney, whoever we've contracted out to do the work, and work to clean up any title defects that we see. And then for the trustees, our policy is that properties that we take on in fee ownership, we get title insurance for. But for some of our conservation restriction properties, we sometimes just stop at getting a title report done and making sure that title is clean. As clean as it can be before that transfer happens. And then part of the closing of the deal would be for that attorney to then do just a last minute rundown of title at the time of closing to make sure nothing has popped up in between the time they did this title report and the present closing date. So there wasn't, I'm not going to talk about a survey for this project. Cynthia is going to talk a lot more about surveys. Because we had already done some survey work in terms of it being a conservation restriction. We were the landowner on multiple sides. There was another CR on one of the property boundaries, and then some really good monumentation that we had done. So we felt like we didn't need to do any additional survey work on this project, but Cynthia will go into some examples of that. But I did want to mention the appraisal aspect of this project. So since this was a donation, we did not feel as an organization that we needed to have an appraisal done for the property, because we didn't need to have that fair market value given to us in order to set a purchase price that was at fair market value. But since this was a gift of land, the landowner was interested in having a IRS federal charitable tax deduction. So when that comes into play, this moves on from standard 9 of LTA standards and practices to standard 10, which talks about tax benefits and appraisals, and really trying to avoid fraudulent or abusive transactions. So in this case, our landowner, Mr. Morse, had an appraisal done, and then his attorney worked to review that appraisal and gather the information needed to fill out a form 8283, which is a charitable contribution form that the IRS has. And we, as the land trust, needed to sign off on what that value was for that charitable deduction. But the most important piece there was we wanted to make sure we weren't having any fraudulent transactions and being really careful to review that transaction before we signed that document, because that's essentially attesting that we agree to the value that the appraiser has laid out in that appraisal document, and that we recognize the value of their charitable deduction for that specific monetary value. So that's where appraisals can be asked for either by the land trust or by the landowner. And it really just depends on the deal structure of when you need an appraisal and why you need an appraisal. And is it for the land trust need, or are we just accepting a donation? And in that instance, it's much more for the landowner's sake. All right, that concludes our first case study. Cynthia, I'll pass it on to you for our second case study.
Great. Thank you, Olivia. So I'm going to talk to you about the Thistle Rock Farm, which we thought was 44 acres, but once we did the survey, we realized it was 48 acres. So we got the boundaries clarified through this process, which was great. The Thistle Rock Farm is a property, an agricultural property in New Braintree. And, you know, my small organization in central Massachusetts, we're really fortunate to have a lot of kind of hilltop farms, which, as you could see from the pictures there, it's this great big drumlin with beautiful views. Yeah, right there. Sorry. Yeah, so you can see it's this great big field. And it has adjoining wetlands and a bit of woods. And there's also a small portion of the property that is pasture. He raises cows, cattle, and also mostly does hay. So what we did, the former owner actually had an accident, an agricultural accident, and the person who ended up buying the property was friends and had helped maintain the property while the former owner was in the hospital for several months before he passed away. And Alden Broadmerkle, who's the guy that owns it now, you know, they couldn't afford to outright purchase the entire property. And so what we did was we worked with them, and the land trust bought the agricultural lands that we knew would qualify for the APR program, the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program. And Alden and his family bought the house and another smaller piece of property. So we kind of divvied it up that way, knew that it was going to take several years to go through the process, the APR process. And yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the due diligence that I'm going to share now is from when we acquired it, the East Quabbin Land Trust acquired it. And then others have happened through that process when for APR in order to acquire the APR on the 48 acres that is now conserved. Okay, so next slide. So Olivia talked about title, gave you good background. So here's part of the title report from when we the East Quabbin Land Trust purchased the property. You can see the kind of encumbrances that are mentioned, as is typical in many places. You know, there was an original deed that was a larger piece of property, and then certain parcels, mostly frontage parcels, are deeded out over the years for different things. And so you can see like 1, 4, and 5 are different parcels that were deeded out of the larger property at one point. And of course, number 3 is the Chapter 61A designation. So that's just acknowledging that it's in that current use tax program. It's good to know that. You should certainly know that when you're acquiring a piece of property, but that's not you know, anything to be concerned about per se. And then also the use of the poles, the electric poles, that happens somewhat frequently. It's happened on a number of other properties that there are easements for some of those kinds of uses. And you know, you're always going to recommend that you hire a title attorney to do the actual title report for you. Before you get that far, you're probably going to want to do your own title search. And so I'm not sure how many of you have done that in the past, but you can get onto the online website, you know, land records, Mass Land Records. Is that right? Mass Land Registry. It just pops up on my inbox now. Anyway, if you go to the Registry of Deeds and go to your county, you can search back by name, by book and page. You can look for surveys and all of those kinds of things. Typically, a title report will go back at least 50 years. And what you want to do is you want to be sure that the title, there you go, Mass Land Records, thank you. You want to be sure that the description of your property kind of carries back over time, and that there's a clear channel of the land transferring from one to another. Sometimes land, it's more complicated than that. And if land gets transferred through probate, that's a more challenging thing to find, the probate records, but that's pretty important. We just had a property that came through probate, and it had been divided into 6 siblings, and then all of those interests kind of finally came together again. But it's more of a web to weave to figure out the actual ownership. And so before you get too far, you should actually double check the title yourself, kind of run back and make sure that you can find it at least 50 years, if not more. So I guess also in sharing kind of some of the information about the costs, a typical title report for us and we're in Worcester County, is somewhere between $350 and $500, kind of depending on the complexity of the title report and how much time it will take for people to do. And as Olivia mentioned, it's really important to look at those, the encumbrances are as follows, the numbered pieces at the bottom, just to make sure that there's nothing there to cause alarm or concern. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say there. All right. Standards and practice that 9D is all about surveying and knowing the proper boundaries. What I'm showing you here is this is actually the survey that we had done for the excluded area. And you can see running down along the bottom there is the road, and you can see the building outline. So the farmhouse is the building to the right, and the larger building to the left is the barn. And so we were excluding some portion of the property that we acquired. We acquired the other partial, the other part of the land that's on this side of the road. And we needed to exclude the piece that we weren't going to acquire. And so we needed a meets and bounds description. And that means essentially your directionals and your distance. So it'll be, north 15 degrees, west 500 feet or something to a corner, and it kind of goes all the way around the perimeter of what the land that you're either excluding or you're including. So at this stage, we were basically excluding the land that's surveyed here from what we acquired. And I guess I would just put out there that a survey isn't always required. It's good due diligence to do, especially in a case like this where you're separating out one portion of a property from another. I would absolutely get a survey done at that point. I would just highlight that if you've got a really good meets and bounds description and there's stone walls all around, or in our case, in another project that we're involved in, we're two sides of the boundary. The town forest is the other side of the boundary, and then the river is the fourth side. And it's all backland. So, the threat of any kind of, violation or encroachment, because we don't know the actual boundaries, is fairly minimal, right? So due diligence is all about managing risk. And so in that case, the cost, a $12,000 to $15,000 survey out in the backwoods was something that we thought we couldn't afford, didn't actually need to cover, because we were acquiring the land. It was going to go with our adjoining property. So again, it's just, your kind of risk assessment. In this case, we absolutely needed a survey. And you come up with your meets and bounds description that will go into the subsequent deeds based on the survey information that you have. So yeah, so this, right, when you actually read the standards and practices, the survey is all about both the legal description and the physical boundaries. So knowing exactly where the pins are, where the stone walls are, all of that kind of stuff is very important. Okay, so maybe the next slide then. So obviously we're still on surveys. And if you look at this map, what I just want to point out is along on this map, because it's got the whole property that went into the APR, the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program. The carve out that I just showed the survey of is right there, kind of on the the top side towards of the road. And that is the area that was excluded. The APR program currently requires a full perimeter survey of the properties that they're acquiring. So there was no choice but to get a full perimeter survey. In this case, we would want to do it anyway. There's part of the town line is in this boundary description. There's also some corners that weren't quite known. And in fact, it took quite a bit of work from the surveyor in order to close the loop. And basically what that means is the surveyor can go from either direction and they want to actually land at the same spot when they're on the back side of the property. And it was off by, I think it was only like 1.5 feet, but it was off still. And so they had to make a boundary line adjustment and work with the neighboring property owner in order to say, okay, well, this is what we're going to say, this is where the corner is. So let's see. The other piece, or another piece that if you haven't had much experience with surveys, to be sure, I mean, your surveyor is going to do this, but just to make note that there's both a scale. So there's a scale bar on the bottom, right? That can, I think that's in feet. And so that you could measure off, you could scale off different things if you needed. On the upper part of the map, you'll see the north arrow. So that kind of orients you. It tells you how the land and the property lays north, south. Also on the upper top that's the recording block that tells you what the plan, book, and page is and the date that it was recorded. There's also a locus map, so it shows you where this property is in relation to the community that you're talking about. What you can't read, of course, are the notes that are just underneath that locus plan, and that tells you, that references the other deeds that all of this information came off of. Some of the information is like from adjoining properties, and so that's all referenced there. Kind of down in the bottom right-hand corner is actually the title block, saying who the land is, where it is, who the plan preparer was, kind of their certification. And then of course on the lower left is actually the legend. What do all the different symbols that are used in a survey plan, what do they mean? What does an iron pin look like? What does an iron pin that's going to be set look like? Where's the stone wall? Those kinds of things. And this particular survey, I don't remember the exact number of how much it costs, but it's somewhere in the order of $16,000 to do a full perimeter survey of 48 acres. So just to have a sense as to how much those things might cost when you're planning to do any project, when you're figuring out your budget. Okay, then next slide then. All right, so I know this is kind of fuzzy, but this is the sales adjustment page from the appraisal that was completed for the APR purchase. And so Olivia showed you the page of their appraisal where it identified some of the sales, the comparable sales, right? So one of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about is the appraisal process, to make sure that at least there's a base knowledge from everybody on this webinar about how appraisals are done. And there's multiple ways that they could be done. The comparable sales approach is the one that most of our land conservation projects occur under. There's also like an income approach. That is if there's a lot of rental property or value or things like that. We don't have those kinds of situations. So when you contract with an appraiser, what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, we're trying to figure out the value, what would it be worth somebody to buy this particular piece of property? And the only way to do that is to say, okay, well, it's 100 acres and it's got so much frontage, which means it can have so many house lots, or because residential development is usually the highest and best use for properties in our area. I would just say that in other parts of the country, there might be other highest and best uses. For instance, one other example is like a remote property in northern Maine might be, I've seen appraisals where, transmission lines was actually the highest and best use, right? So there's different ways, but typically in our area, they're going to evaluate that, but mostly the highest and best use is going to be residential development. And what they do is they look at what other properties in the area, they try to get them as close as possible so that they've got the same kind of market exposure, the same, and not too long, not happening too far in the past, right? So that they don't have to make too many adjustments. But what this shows is that there were 6 different properties that were considered as comparable sales. So that's the language, comparable sales. And the columns then go down. So the first column, of course, is what we're looking at. And then there's the subject. So that's the 48 acres in New Braintree that we're trying to figure out what the value is. And then there's sale 1 through sale 6. And it tells you, where it is, how much it actually sold for, what the date was. And then you get down to the second tier, kind of in the middle here, where it says cumulative adjustments. And so that's trying to figure out, are the market conditions the same? Are there timing changes? Did it happen so far in the past that there need to be some positive adjustments because the market has increased or decreased over time? And so though, mostly she's got kind of similar, she's written in similar there for a lot of those things. And that means that it's much more comparable. She's not actually making a lot of sales adjustments. The third section down there talks about kind of the size or the location. Does it have, utilities, whereas the, that are different, or those sorts of things. Are the soils better or worse than what the subject property is? And so that's where she also has a lot of similars, but there's also like, it's an inferior property or it's slightly superior. So that's what you're paying the appraiser to do, is to evaluate how your property that you're trying to buy or sell, or, that's transferring, you're trying to find the value for that property. How does it compare to other ones that have reasonably sold? And so she uses all that evaluation and then comes up with adjustments. And that's where kind of, not the very bottom line, but the next line down at the bottom there, that's where she adjusts the per acre value. And that's how this particular appraisal was done, was on a per acre value. Sometimes I've seen appraisals that have been done on a per lot value. And I'm not sure exactly, I can't remember exactly why there's that difference, but oftentimes it's on a per acre value. And then that value is then multiplied out by however many acres you're trying to acquire or conserve. So then I would just let's see, looking back. Okay. So that's how basically an appraisal is done. And typically, if you're just acquiring the property outright, not doing a conservation restriction or an APR, you just need that one layer of appraisal. If you're doing a conservation, like if you're acquiring a conservation restriction or an agricultural preservation restriction, you're going to need a second layer. And so that's the before value. So that's what we were just talking about. What is it now where it's unrestricted? So the before, it's restricted value. And then the appraiser will also do, or can also do, an after value, an after restricted value. So that's assuming that you could not do any development. And they would do the same thing. What similar properties of a similar size and location and all that kind of stuff, what have those sold for? And so doing that comparable sales, they would do the adjustments, and that would come out with a per acre value after the property is restricted. And so how you figure out what the value is for both for the conservation restriction or the APR is that you take the before restricted value, you subtract out the after restricted value, because basically that's the value that the landowner is going to retain. And that difference is it's a reduction in the value, but the conservation restriction or the APR, that is the difference. And so when you're, going to acquire a conservation restriction, it's that difference that you're looking for. Let's see. The other thing, when you're looking at standards and practices, they do talk about, in H2, it does talk about that in limited circumstances, you may not need an appraised value. But that's really, I'm sorry, it's in 1A. It's when it has a low economic value, like there's really not a whole lot, and you're or you're buying it at a below market rate. And sometimes that can happen when it's on the market and you're putting in an offer to bid, you don't have time to do an appraisal. So there's some times when it's not needed, but in general, you want to get an appraisal to be sure that you're not privately benefiting a private individual, the former owner. You want to, it's just as Olivia said, when you as the land trust sign off on the 8283, you want to assure when somebody's made a donation that they're not take an unreasonable, right? They have a reasonable value that they've assigned to their donation. So I believe that's what I also wanted to just say that for a typical appraisal for us, it's about $3,500 to get an appraisal. Somewhere, if it's more complicated, it can be $5,000. Or if you have to do a yellow book appraisal, which is the standard to meet for federal dollars, then it's like double the figure in terms of getting the appraisal done. But it'll be somewhere in there, at least in central Massachusetts. So I think that's what I had to share. Back to you, Olivia.
You have one more.
Oh, I have one more. Got it. So what I'm showing you here is the outline of the property, and standard 11 talks about baseline documentation report. And I always got a little flummoxed with those words, but when I look at it clearly, take each of the baseline documentation report separately, you can understand what you're really trying to do. What this kind of report tries to do is to just say, hey, what does this property look like now? Where are we starting? What's the starting point for this the conservation of this property? A baseline documentation report is going to have several key elements. It's going to have, written narrative. Who is it? What is it? What does it look like? It's going to have maps. This is one of the maps from the baseline documentation report for Thistle Rock Farm. It's going to have photographs and descriptions of photographs. So it's, in some ways, it's fairly similar to what Olivia showed. The photographic page is similar to what Olivia showed for an environmental site assessment. But a baseline documentation report is really going to be focused on kind of the perimeters. So on this map, the red outline is the parcels that are covered by the APR, and the blue outline with the green dots, those green dots are where he took photographs, and the blue is his route, following along the perimeter of the property. A baseline documentation report, we've got it in here. It's not necessarily something that you have to do for like pre-acquiring the property, but yet you actually want to do it before, if you can, before you record it, because it means that you've been around the property, you know exactly what it looks like. It's sometimes hard to get that finished before recording the CR, that's but if you're getting any of the state grants, they're going to want to see this before you get the reimbursement. So anyway, it's a good thing to do as soon as possible. And it also helps you document, what are the conservation values? Why is this so important to protect? Yeah, okay, now I think I'm done.
Great, thanks, Cynthia. So the third case study we wanted to present you all with is the fee purchase of some acreage. And I think, as I was going through my case study and then listening to Cynthia's, I think sometimes one of the hardest part is just determining what is the order you do each of these pieces of due diligence in. How do you decide what you can do in-house versus what you can do get contracted out? And each of the projects that I've worked on have looked a little bit different. So for some properties, we'll actually pursue an appraisal really as the first step of a project, because we want to understand if we're looking to purchase this property, is this something that we even have the finances for, whether through donors or through grants? Is this a project that's even feasible for us? In other cases, an appraisal might come along as you're doing your other elements of due diligence. But really for the environmental due diligence, for the title work, for the appraisal, and the survey work, those are all kind of happening simultaneously at the same time. You're getting your title report back, you're reviewing that, or you're working on clearing the title at the same time that you're maybe working with the surveyor. Maybe there's an okay plan of record somewhere in the registry, but it would be really helpful for the conservation easement or conservation restriction to have certain levels of monumentation along a subdivision boundary or something like that. So when you all are thinking about your projects, you're gathering as much information as you can from the landowner as you're starting to build what this transaction or what this deal would look like, and deciding what contractors are the best to use in this circumstance, and what information do we need sooner rather than later. But ideally, you're really getting all of this done before the transaction is complete and before it goes on record and the deal is done. So just wanted to qualify that a little bit more. But this third case study that I'm going to talk about is an acquisition of a 2-acre-ish property in Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard. And I say ish because the reason we are acquiring this property is really intense erosion that was happening on that site. And on this map, the property is outlined in red, and our Wasque reservation is that bigger blue block. And this property up until this past winter had a house on it, but Norton Point Beach often has a lot of breaches and really changes that coastline and changes those barrier beaches. And so the house that was on that site was really at risk of falling into the water and being destroyed through natural erosion processes. They were losing sometimes up to like 20 feet of land in a day in really bad storm surges. And so we were working with the landowners, and the landowners contacted us to see if we would be interested in acquiring their property as their house was actively falling into the ocean. And we did pursue this project because we really owned the surrounding land, and we wanted to not have a new inholding within our reservation, but also we were worried that if the landowners didn't clean up that site properly, that there was going to be a lot of debris from the house structure and the utilities washing up on our beaches and just polluting the general landscape around it. So that's a little bit more of the setup of this property. And when I talked about that first fee acquisition that was a gift, for that instance, we contracted out our environmental due diligence. In this circumstance, we did our own due diligence in-house. And so how that works is we can request a report from EDR, Environmental Data Resources, LLC. I think that's probably one of the most common ones that people use. I don't actually know of any other ones, but they're the EDR Lightbox reports. We requested a data package that had an aerial photo decade package. So you can see that image on the upper left. They have a number of aerial photos of that property. This one is back to 1938. So they're with relative frequency throughout the years. And actually for this property, it was really interesting to see the frequency of the breaches and when erosion was taking land away versus when land was being built back up. So we could kind of get a sense of what has been happening with that property over time. The package that we requested from EDR also had a city directory image report. So that didn't really have any information for us because this is one small residential lot surrounded by vacant land, which is our reservation, but that would also have a lot more information if this was in more of like a city center or just had a lot more development around it. The report package also comes with historical topo maps. So that's what you see on that right-hand image. And these are really cool. They go back sometimes centuries. This one was from the late 1800s. And again, really interesting. You can see the development of the surrounding area, the development of that parcel as it changes, as more roads are developed. In this case, as the beaches eroded and different breaches happened. So getting to see these historical documents is really interesting. And you can also see what that land use was over time to see if there's anything that kind of sets off any red flags in your head of like, oh, one of these maps is showing like a larger industrial use or agricultural use, or there was a house and it's no longer there. So you can get a sense of what to look for when you're out on site visits, and then also review an additional layer of the package, which is a radius map report. And the whole package that we request from EDR also includes a review of any databases where there's like known contaminants. So obviously the big ones would be like brownfield sites, but less intense contaminants can also be documented there, even if it didn't happen on site. But if there was some sort of documented environmental degradation that happened in the surrounding area, you can get on a map a sense of where those environmental hazards might be in relation to the property that you're looking at. So that report is just really helpful to review. The cost for the report package for this project was about $350, and then the rest of it was just staff time. So you can see that's a really big difference. Using a contractor, it was about $3,000. For this one, it was $350 to get this additional information. And then we continued to do the rest of that work for the environmental site assessment on our own. So we went out to the site, we documented different aspects of the site with photographs, and then we write a memo to our project files. So we have a memo that, you know, says when our like internal report was done, what records we reviewed, what came up on each of those record packages, displays of the photographs we took on site, and then any like recommendation that we would have. So saying like, this looks good to go. And again, you know, you could do this type of environmental due diligence in-house, but if something did come up, like if we had found some evidence of, again, some sort of soil contamination or something that really made us question, we might then choose to reach out to a consultant again to have some more follow-up testing done of the site. But the site was in pretty good shape as part of our due diligence work, but also part of just our kind of like pre-closing. When we went out to the site, the house had been removed by the landowners, and Eversource for their electric utilities had come out and taken the meter and like shut off the wires, but we found this big tangle of wires and the structure from the meter holder, this wooden frame left. And in our purchase and sales agreement that we had put together with this landowner, we had asked that the site be cleared of any structures and utilities. So it's really important to just get out on the site multiple times throughout the project to really see how things are changing, especially if you're asking the landowners for certain things to be done before closing. We really wanted to go out and make sure that everything was good. So we saw those wires, we photographed that, we sent that information to the landowner, and said, you know, here are your options. You know, you can ask Eversource if they can do more. You can see if your caretaker can take care of this. Our staff didn't really have time to deal with this at the moment, but the one thing we did offer to them was we could contact a contractor for you and set everything up and do the legwork, but you would have to pay for the costs of that removal. So they ended up taking care of it themselves, and we visited the site again to make sure, again, everything was good and we could really check off that environmental due diligence from this project. In terms of the title investigation for this project, there was a number of things that came up. And when you look at a full title report, depending on the property and it's the property's history and use over time, it could be varying levels of length, but you'll see that Cynthia and I have just taken little screenshots from different reports and that we've gotten, whether it's for the title or the appraisal or whatnot. But for this appraisal in particular, the way the title attorney structured it was really looking at the top section that were requirements to be complied with. And you can see here, one of the things that we had to do to have more of a clear title was under 1D. The title company wanted a confirmatory deed recorded. And so there was, when this title review was done, it was noticed that some of that chain of ownership had some inconsistencies in it between the landowners being individually named, when they were named as a married couple versus an individual, and then when they had internally transferred their ownership over to an LLC or real estate trust. And so there was just some inconsistencies in that, which I've definitely seen before. A lot of times when people move from an LLC or a trust or to an LLC or a trust, there can be some confusion of exactly that chain of ownership. So, 1D came up and got flagged for us. And so as part of our recording package, we needed to have a confirmatory deed drafted. Another thing that came up in this title report under section 2, which is not on the screen, but it's the section where the title company said this policy will contain exceptions for section. There was a existing or outstanding order of conditions noted, and those come up quite a bit as well on title reports. This will come up when the landowner is doing something that requires an order of conditions from the town or city's conservation commission. And so this property had some bank stabilization order of conditions that were outstanding. And so in order to clear that and have that not exist on the title, we worked with the landowner to reach out to that conservation commission and get a certificate of compliance so that was all good. And that project, that environmental conditions project, had been closed out. Another thing that you'll see under number 5 here is that there was this mortgage that was recorded, and this had come up, and when we first got the title report back, we thought this mortgage was going to need to be discharged. The attorney we were working with worked with the title company a little bit more and found out that it was actually so old that it was kind of fine and it was okay to remain in the way it was. But I think that's an important note is, there are so many factors that can come up in each of these elements of due diligence, and especially in title work, that it's really helpful to talk through the issues that you see on the title report with your attorney and say, what can we do to clear this? Is this an issue? Is this not an issue? And each time we get a title report back, it feels like there's some little tweak or variation that is slightly different than we've seen before. And the last thing I'll mention for this title report, because I think it can also come up a lot, is there was evidence of a footpath on the property, and it was just noted for us that might mean that there are others that have use or access rights to the property. So we needed to be aware of that as well. It wasn't any recorded easement, but sometimes with land use, when people use a certain aspect of a property for enough time, there can essentially be a lien on that property by someone else in terms of just using a cart path or a walking path across the property. So in terms of the appraisal for this one, so Cynthia showed you that adjustments table. Appraisals are also often quite long documents, and there's a number of different parts to them. Sometimes I find it really helpful when doing any type of documentation for projects to go to the summary pages of the appraisals, because the appraiser has done such an amazing job compiling so much data and evidence. So sometimes when I'm doing BDRs for a conservation restriction, I'll actually go to the appraisal and look at some of the maps that they created and some of the details, just because they've compiled all that information so efficiently. So for this property, this was an example where the appraiser did a sales comparison approach, just as Cynthia mentioned. So looking at other properties in the area, because there was so much erosion on this property, it was deemed to be vacant and unbuildable land. There really wasn't a plan for more buildings or residential buildings to go on that site. So the highest and best use was essentially beach access, which if you work on the vineyard, you know is quite expensive. I am sometimes shocked to work on the vineyard compared to other parts of the state. So it was actually found that this property, the defendable opinion of value, which is what an appraisal is, came out to be $180,000. We had already kind of guesstimated what we thought that was going to come out as in our negotiation process, and we thought it was going to come out actually a little bit lower. So we had first approached the landowners and offered to purchase the property for them for $80,000. They said no. We came back and asked for $100,000, and that's what we wrote into our purchase and sales agreement. And actually it came back and it was valued at much more, but we had already agreed upon the $100,000. If it had come back lower than the $100,000, we would have had to amend our purchase and sales agreement again, just making sure that we weren't doing any private benefit for that individual, just in the sake of our nonprofit status. But this appraisal came in higher, so we were good to go. And I think just building upon what Cynthia said, appraisals are really looking at that highest and best use. So what the appraiser is able to do is ask, like, what is legally permissible according to zoning, what is physically possible on site. So although this site might have been zoned for residential, physically it was not going to be possible to build a house on this site again. And then also what is financially possible as well for the site. And this is a pretty straightforward appraisal. Sometimes we work with an appraiser that has more of an engineering department because we need them to draft up subdivision plans or just more extensive land use plans of the property so that we can get a sense of what that value might be, because it might be just an open 30 acres of land at the moment, but you could put a number of house developments on it, and we actually need that engineer to say, this is how this lot could be subdivided, this is how many houses could potentially go on it, and this is the value. So really knowing what to ask your appraiser is important in terms of determining what level of an appraisal you need and what that information you need from the appraiser is. So I think that is the end of our three different case studies. So we wanted to give plenty of time for questions for folks. I'm going to stop screen sharing, but I'm happy to pop slides back up if there are specifics that we want to talk about from those case studies and using those case studies to have discussion, or if people have additional questions that they want to ask or clarifying questions, we're happy to both try to answer them ourselves and then also use the resources in this room if other folks have questions as well, and that they want answered from someone based on what you all have discussed in previous weeks.
Thanks very much, Cynthia and Olivia, for a really in-depth presentation. At the beginning, it was mentioned that service providers, where you'll need an appraiser, how to find this, that, and the other service providers. I put a link in the chat. We do have a list of service providers on the MLTC website. It's not the only ones there are, but those are the ones that have dealt at least with one of our member land trusts. So they're sort of vetted, but not quite. Let's start at the beginning. Carol asks, when trash is documented, as you saw on one of the photos, is it required that the landowner clean it up?
It kind of depends on what that relationship with the landowner is like. If it is just some pots and like potting material and kind of garden refuse, like a lot of what was found on that site in Dover, that's pretty easy. We might just ask for them to clean it up, or we might just like walk through on one of our own inspections and pick it up. If it's really extensive, or in terms of like bigger issues that might come out of that underground storage tank, it's likely that we're going to ask the landowner to pay for that cleanup. But depending on the situation, depending on the structure of the deal, we might help them with it, or we might pick up the cost. So I think it's a little bit project dependent and relationship dependent. In this instance, I don't think we required that landowner to pick anything up. I think we left the like larger tank structure out there because it was just off trail. There wasn't really any risk of anyone running into it, and collected that trash in terms of the gardening trash. I think what's interesting about specifically working in Massachusetts and New England is there's such a long and varied colonial land use history, and sometimes we want to highlight that. So for example, the trustees just acquired Beckett Quarry in 2021, and there's a lot of what you could consider trash out there, but we are choosing to leave to tell the story of that property. So we decided to intentionally leave the derrick, which is like a large pole that was used in the quarrying process, and a lot of the quarrying machinery and railroads and things like that, that although might have become flagged during that environmental due diligence process, we wanted to leave to tell the story of the land.
And I guess I would just add to what Olivia said there that whenever you have environmental trash or debris that needs to get cleaned up or should get cleaned up, depending on, it doesn't necessarily matter on who does the cleanup, but that would be or ought to be reflected in the purchase price, or you know what you're going to put in as the land trust, right? So I have done projects where we knew we were going to need to clean it up, but it was also reflected, that additional cost was reflected in what we were willing to pay. And sometimes you need to move faster than landowners, or they can't, they need you to move faster. They can't clean it up. But it's such an important property to conserve that you're willing to go ahead and acquire it and to do the cleanup, but you just, you offset that anticipated expense in how much you're willing to pay.
Okay, so you've basically answered Tom's question regarding an environmental assessment if they're rusted barrels. It really depends on the relationship and talking to the landowner and the relationship with them. Rob, do you want to ask your question?
I do just want to highlight one aspect of Tom's question before I ask mine. So he's actually saying who should pay for the environmental site assessment. So I would take, is Olivia, from your presentation, I'm sort of gathering you feel like that's your responsibility as the buyer.
Yes.
Because you're doing your own homework.
Yes,
Due diligence.
that's a great clarification, Rob. Yeah, we're doing the assessment piece itself. It's the cleanup aspect that might differ who's paying for it.
Yeah. So my question had to do with a survey piece. And Cynthia, I was just kind of curious, in your example, there seems like there were two different surveys. First, there was carving out the retained lot. And was that the grantor's dime that paid for that because it was, or not necessarily, or is this again something that's very negotiable depending on what's happening?
It is very negotiable. In that particular case, the land trust paid for that first survey, so that we could separate out the lots between what, the future owner, Alden, was going to buy and what we were going to acquire. And then the way APR does their surveys is APR, the program themselves, will pay for the full survey, but they expect the landowner to cover 50% of the cost. So as they go through that process, the landowner and APR agree on what the appraisal gets done. They agree on what APR is willing to pay for the APR. And then at closing, they'll take off half of the survey cost. And for them, the caveat is that if the landowner doesn't go through with the appraisal, then the landowner, with the sale of the APR, then the landowner has to cover the full survey cost, because that's really a benefit to the landowner to know what the outline of their property is, right? And so if they don't do the APR, then the APR program shouldn't have to pay for that, because that's nothing that they're retaining. There's no value in what they're retaining.
And just quickly, I don't know if it's a little off topic, but I was curious when surveys might require a town signature, planning board or otherwise, before the plan is deemed final and recorded. Like if there's a lot.
I think they always do.
Even if there's no
You don't,
new
if,
lot being created?
right, only in that case do you not have to get it signed off on, but like basically every survey that we do, because we're usually dividing a parcel. You know, you have to go before the planning board, and it's a fairly straightforward process. I mean, surveyors obviously know what the requirements are to get a, you know, a survey approved.
Mhm. I just wonder if you could say, this kind of goes to the question Barbara and I got yesterday.
Yeah.
So you at one point, Cynthia, said that you might not need a survey until you ran into the APR program requirement. So can you say just a little bit more about when you might not get a survey? I think Olivia's first example included not getting a survey. So can you say a little bit more about that? And is it
Well,
linked to your title report results, or is it not? You know, I don't know.
I mean, you know, surveys are all about knowing where the land is, where the boundaries are, and how it's defined. And if you have a very clearly defined property, even if it doesn't have a plan with specific meets and bounds already made out by a surveyor and signed off on and recorded in the registry, if you know where the boundaries are, your deed is very clear, you might not need to have a survey done. It's when there's ambiguity or you're actually subdividing parcels that the survey is going to be essential. So the other example that I mean, I didn't have a slide for it, but I was just sharing with you is that, you know, the East Quabbin Land Trust has acquired a 50-acre parcel. It's out in the backwoods. Our existing property is, you know, 2 of the sides. The town of Ware's forest land is the 3rd side, and the river is the 4th side. So in that case, you know, we couldn't justify and didn't feel like we needed to justify spending $15,000 or something to get a survey when the threat of encroachment isn't there. There actually are stone walls that go all the way around except for the river. You know, so again, a survey is all about knowing where the land is. If you have any questions about that, you're going to want to get a survey. If you really don't have questions about it, then you might not need a survey. You know, if you can define the property and both in the deed define the property and on the ground define the property.
So the person's question, again, he couldn't attend today, but the person's questions were exactly this. He was asked by his town to provide a plan of the CR and a title of certification. So we thought a plan of the CR was a survey, but what is a plan of the CR and what is a title of certification?
Well, the title of certification, I mean, I would get that's the title examiner who goes back through and he certifies that yep, this deed follows through and that this is owned by so-and-so, right? So that's the title report component of it. And you know, a plan, I mean, I just submitted a conservation restriction that has I just made a GIS plan for that property that I was just talking to you about. And, you know, showed the boundaries. It doesn't include that. It's not a meets and bounds. It's not presented as a survey. We title that as a sketch.
Okay.
And sometimes for us, when we specifically for CRs, if we are looking through the registry and doing our own research, as Cynthia mentioned, of looking through that chain of title and looking at the plans or surveys that have been recorded, I have definitely used existing plans that have been recorded as my plan for a CR, simply because there hasn't been any further subdivision. That shape of the land is the same. There's no question of where the land is. So in that instance, we could use what was already recorded and we did not have to pay for an additional survey to be done.
Super.
I mean, again, all of this is about how much risk do you want to take, right? If it's very low risk, it's very low risk and you probably don't need a survey. But if there's higher risk because you don't actually know where it is or what you're doing with, you know, where the property is or how to define it, you might need the professional help and get a formal survey done.
Yeah. All right. Moving on to the other one. Let's see here. Regarding the difference between the before appraisal and after appraisal, is the bigger the difference, the better for the land trust, or the smaller the difference, the better?
You know, I think it would be good to ask Kathy's question at the same time, because it's sort of on the same topic.
Okay,
So
and then she's
regarding-
also,
yeah,
yeah.
Go ahead.
And she's also, Kathy's asking, the fee value versus a CR value, is it generally an accepted percent of fee versus CR? So it's all like, what does that mean?
I think that really looks at the specifics of what that property is. So for Cynthia, when she was talking about that backwoods example, there might be no access to that property. So that feasibility of developing that property and having its highest and best use be residential might not be realistic. So it might be valued for the timber production or the timber on site. So in terms of like, is there a generally accepted percentage? Not really. It's just noting what the factors of that property are. So for example, I'm in the process of working on a CR as part of our Marine Farm reservation in Beverly. And the city of Beverly is purchasing a CR for $1.1 million because the value of that land to be developed for houses was so high. And then if you took away that ability to develop those houses, and then it was just vacant land for maybe some agricultural use, and then that value is so low, there ends up being this really big difference. But that difference could be much smaller if you're then not really able to develop that land and sell off that land as house lots or residential or commercial use. So there's not necessarily like, is it a better or worse in terms of, are we purchasing a CR? I mean, it's nicer if that difference is smaller because then the price of the CR is lower. But if it's a really large difference, and they're donating the CR, then there's the potential that that landowner could get that larger value for a charitable donation. So it's not really a better or worse, and it's not necessarily is an accepted amount, but that is where you do want to review that appraisal and look at the different, if it's a sales comparison approach, look at the different sales that they're citing as sales that are comparable to the piece of property you're working on. Do they make sense? Do you think those adjustments make sense? Does the timing make sense to actually denote a specific value for that conservation restriction? Cynthia, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I don't have much to add to that because that is the right answer. It really depends. Because it really depends on what the property is, because not every property is the same. The amount of road frontage, the amount of acreage, the actual, just because you have a lot of road frontage does not mean that it's buildable or 100% buildable. I mean, I just went to look at a 9-acre parcel that had maybe 1,500 feet of road frontage and 1.5 acre zoning. So potentially it could be 6 house lots. But you look at the land and there's like ledge on at least a third of it. It's like, no, that's not really it. And so, you have to use your own judgment. And of course, those are pieces that you gain over time and over experience. But, that's where I would say, reach out to other colleagues, ask questions, get some help from other people doing conservation work to think about whether or not, the appraisal makes sense. Is this, are we approaching this conservation project in a reasonable way? What other pieces should we be asking?
Is it not also the case that for a before and after appraisal, they have to look at what the CR actually does, right? Because if the CR extinguishes timber rights and the best value of the property is timber, well, then that's going to affect the after value, right? And similarly, if the landowner retains the ability to build 2 houses or create a big barn, or you sort of have to know what the after rights are before you can establish the after value, right?
To a certain extent, that's right, Rob. I guess in terms of your assessment about timber value, coming from a forestry background and actually reading appraisals, unless I've never seen timber really come into it.
Okay.
Unless it's a really, really large project where timber is really the biggest value. And in that case, the appraiser should ask for the forest management plan and be looking at the high, so if you have really high quality veneer that is going to like bump the value up, that might be taken into account with an appraisal. I personally have never been involved in one of those, but mostly we have general woods and they have some value and they've got some not so good value trees. You know, I mean, so I think in general, appraisers, they don't have that forestry background, and so they would need to rely on a forester to help them do that kind of evaluation. And unless the comparable sales also includes, you know, well, what is the timber value? It's really hard to do the match and match, which is why I think they stick with comparable sales, because they're looking for, you know, the residential value, you know, road frontage, acreage, zoning requirements are more the key pieces in an appraisal.
Okay. Another question that you may have answered, should a land trust absorb the cost of an appraisal to check on the landowner's appraisal before signing the 8285 form? So kind of like checking up on the guy.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, you definitely want to review that appraisal and have it pass your sniff test. If there's any question of inflated value, the land trust does not need to sign that 8283. You're not guaranteeing, as we talked about with, you know, sections A and B of Standard 9, you're not giving any tax advice. You're not giving any financial advice. They're really relying on their own contracted out or their own representation for their legal and financial advice. And so you're really not guaranteeing that the IRS would accept that donation. And if you think there's some vacant lot that you put a CR on and it's only should be worth like $50,000 and that appraisal comes back and says, this is worth 1.2 million, you know, you can say like, we're not signing this. This doesn't make sense. I think what you could do, which is less expensive, is there's a way to have essentially a peer review process for an appraiser. You could have a different appraiser review that appraisal and say, yes, I think this is meeting best standards and practices for the appraiser, and they're following all of the right rules and regulations according to that profession. And I think this is an accurate assessment of value. I personally have not seen that happen in terms of signing an 8283. But if there was really some concern, that would be a way to have an appraiser check that value. But you can certainly just not sign if you think it's some fraudulent appraisal.
So I just want to reemphasize that you as the land trust, when you've accepted either a property and fee or a conservation restriction, you need to request that their appraisal, you need to physically have that a copy of that document, because you do need to do what Olivia said, which is review it, because you're going to be asked to sign it. I just want to clarify for Tom that it's the IRS form. It's the 8283 is the charitable donation form that you'll be asked to sign, and to be sure that you sign it in the order that it's there on the form. So the landowner should be signing it first, then the appraiser should be assigning it, and then you. So really the appraiser signs it and says, yes, this is the value. And the land trust really signs it and says, yes, we accepted this property, or we accepted the conservation restriction. So we're acknowledging that that donation was actually made. So just be sure that, you know, you're not signing the accepted part before they sign it or before the appraiser signs it, because you want to know that the appraiser's putting their license on the line with that appraised value. But you do need to review the report.
So Rob, your question.
They don't get a tax deduction if you don't sign it.
Okay, but you're saying you shouldn't sign something you don't think is legit, and then they would just be stuck.
They would be stuck without if the land trust, because if you're not acknowledging that the gift was made, and at the value, that's the negotiation piece back and forth. I mean, I've never been in that situation. I've never had anybody try to be fraudulent and cheat. So it's always seemed very reasonable, the numbers that they put on there. But that is what you would have to do. What Olivia said, you need to go back to them, go back to the appraiser and say, this really doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense because of X, Y, or Z. You know, you have other comparable sales, and they would need to redo the appraisal so that they're not trying to overstate their donation.
Okay, those are the questions I see here. If anyone has another question, pop it in the chat or raise your virtual hand. Seeing none. I popped in the chat then a link. Well, actually, Rob popped in the chat the Land Trust Alliance Standards and Practices link. You might want to just take a quick snap of that. All right then. Well, have a good evening and we'll see you next week.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
Emily.